Frostbite doesn't just claim toes and fingers, it freezes the human conscience. When the worst blizzard in a century buried Cresthaven, neighbor turned against neighbor. While the town's outdoor woodpiles became impenetrable blocks of solid ice, one outcast was already sitting by a roaring fire. He knew it was coming. Cresthaven, Colorado, was a town that prided itself on resilience, but complacency has a way of masquerading as preparation. By mid-November, the local hardware store had sold out of snow shovels and road salt, and the townspeople rested easy, confident they were ready for whatever winter threw their way. Nearly every driveway featured a meticulously stacked cord of firewood, neatly covered with blue tarps, standing like monuments to their owner's foresight. But Thomas Granger didn't trust tarps. He didn't trust the unseasonably warm autumn breeze, and he certainly didn't trust the cheery meteorologist on Channel 9 who promised a mild, dry December. Thomas was a retired heavy machinery mechanic, a man whose hands were permanently stained with grease and whose mind was wired to anticipate catastrophic failure. While his neighbors raked the last of the autumn leaves, Thomas was hauling wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of split oak, hickory, and pine directly through his front door. He didn't put it in a shed. He didn't stack it on the porch. He brought it right into his home. His daughter Chloe, visiting from Denver for the Thanksgiving holiday, stood in the hallway with her arms crossed, watching in disbelief as her father dropped a heavy load of rough bark and sawdust onto her childhood home's beige living room carpet. "Dad, what are you doing?" Chloe asked, brushing a stray spider off the sofa. "The house smells like a lumber mill. You've filled the guest room to the ceiling. Now the living room, you're ruining the floors." "Carpets can be vacuumed, Chloe," Thomas muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow, his breathing heavy but steady. "You can't vacuum a frozen corpse. The Farmer's Almanac is predicting a convergence. Freezing rain followed by a polar vortex, a glass drop, they used to call it." From across the property line, the booming laugh of Greg Peterson drifted over the white picket fence. Greg was a corporate litigator who treated mountain living like an extended vacation. He walked over to the property line, leaning against the fence holding a mug of artisanal coffee. "Hey, Tom!" Greg shouted, gesturing to the absolute fortress of firewood he had built in his own backyard. It was a beautiful, symmetrical stack of birch, completely exposed to the elements, save for a flimsy plastic sheet draped over the top row. "You know wood needs to breathe, right? You're going to get termites, or a fire hazard violation. I've got 3 cords out here, more than enough for a few cozy weekends." Thomas paused, holding a heavy piece of oak. He looked at Greg's perfectly manicured woodpile, then up at the greying sky. "You better hope it stays dry, Greg. If the rain hits before the freeze, that tarp isn't going to save you." Greg just chuckled, shaking his head and walking back to his smart home integrated, geothermal heated mansion. Suit yourself, Doomsday. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas became the town punchline. The postal worker joked about delivering mail to a beaver dam. The local grocer asked if he was building an ark, but Thomas ignored them. He stacked the wood meticulously, creating narrow hallways through his own home. He checked his chimney, cleaned the flue, and stocked up on matches and cast-iron cookware. By the time he was finished, he had nearly 5 cords of wood inside his house. He lost his dining room, his guest room, and half his living room, but he slept soundly. The first signs that Thomas was right appeared on December 22nd. It started as a drizzle, a seemingly harmless rain that fell when the temperature hovered at a deceptive 34 degrees. But high above the Rocky Mountains, a massive, unyielding high-pressure system of Arctic air had stalled, forcing its way downward. In a matter of 3 hours, the temperature plummeted from 34 degrees to -10. The rain didn't turn to snow. Instead, it super-cooled. The moment the water droplets touched a surface, a tree branch, a power line, a roof, or a tarp covering a woodpile, they flash froze. It was a devastating, beautiful nightmare. The town of Cresthaven was rapidly encased in a thick, unyielding shell of solid ice. Then came the wind. Gusts of 60 miles per hour tore through the valley, howling like a wounded animal. The ice-heavy branches of ancient pines snapped with sounds like shotgun blasts, bringing down power lines in a cascade of blue-green sparks that lit up the darkening sky. Inside his heavily insulated home, Thomas watched the lights flicker, surge, and finally die. He calmly walked over to his indoor woodpile, pulled a few dry logs of pine to get the kindling going, and struck a match. Within minutes, a warm, golden glow filled the room. The wood was perfectly dry. The fire roared. Outside, the real horror was just beginning. By morning, the temperature had bottomed out at negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit, not factoring in the wind chill. The sun rose to reveal a world trapped in glass. A terrifying, silent realization swept through the 100 or so households in Cresthaven. Help was not coming. The roads were impassable, glazed with 3 inches of solid ice beneath a fresh, drifting layer of snow. The cellular towers, heavily encrusted with ice and deprived of grid power, had failed completely. In his sprawling house next door, Greg Peterson woke up shivering violently. His breath plumed in the air of his master bedroom. His state-of-the-art geothermal heat pump, completely reliant on electricity to circulate the fluid, was dead. His smart thermostat screen was blank. Panic, cold and sharp, gnawed at Greg's chest. His wife and 2 young children were huddled under a pile of down comforters, their lips taking on a faint blue hue. "It's okay," Greg said, his teeth chattering as he pulled on his expensive insulated hunting gear. "We have the fireplace. We have 3 cords of wood. I'll get a fire going." He grabbed his $200 fiberglass splitting maul and trudged out the back door, immediately slipping on the glazed patio and slamming his knee into the concrete. Cursing, he crawled toward his pristine woodpile. When he reached it, his heart stopped. The rain from the previous afternoon had seeped deep into the stacks before the flash freeze hit. The water had filled every gap, every crevice between the logs, and then expanded as it turned to ice. Greg grabbed the blue tarp to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge. It was fused to the wood like a second skin of frozen steel. Desperate, Greg swung his maul at the top of the pile, aiming to break a log free. Clang! The heavy steel head of the maul didn't bite into the wood. It bounced off the thick layer of ice with a jarring vibration that sent a shockwave of pain up Greg's arms. He swung again, harder, screaming in frustration. The maul chipped away a tiny fragment of ice, but the logs were cemented together, forming a monolithic, unbreakable block. He tried to kick a log loose. He tried to use a pry bar. He even retrieved a pot of boiling water from his propane camp stove and poured it on the wood, only to watch it instantly freeze, adding another layer to the icy tomb. His wood was useless. It was right there, visible through the clear ice, but he couldn't burn it. Across town, similar scenes of terror were playing out. Families were shattering axes against frozen outdoor woodpiles. People were crying, their hands bloodied from trying to chisel out a single piece of fuel. In sheer desperation, they began burning anything they could find. Books, dining room chairs, even the molding off their walls. But pine furniture burns fast and yields little lasting heat. Inside Thomas's house, the temperature was a comfortable 68 degrees. He sat in his armchair, a blanket draped over his lap, listening to the agonizing, rhythmic thud, thud, thud echoing through the valley as his neighbors desperately beat against their frozen lifelines. Chloe stood by the frosted window, wiping away a circle of condensation to peer outside. "Dad, Greg is out there. He's been hitting his woodpile with a hammer for an hour. He looks like he can barely stand." Thomas sighed, staring into the flames. "I warned him, Chloe. I warned all of them. We can't just let them freeze," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "We have exactly enough wood to keep us alive if this grid stays down for a month," Thomas said, his voice hardened by the brutal arithmetic of survival. "If we open our doors, if we start handing out wood, we'll be out in a week. Then what? We freeze too." Just then, a heavy, urgent pounding echoed from the front door. It wasn't the frantic knocking of a freezing neighbor. It was authoritative, demanding. Thomas exchanged a tense look with his daughter. He picked up the heavy iron fire poker and walked slowly to the door, pulling it open just a crack. Standing on the porch was Sheriff Brody Hayes. The man looked terrible. His mustache was caked in icicles, and his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep and the biting wind. Behind him stood 2 deputies, their hands resting uneasily near their belts. "Thomas," Sheriff Hayes grunted, his breath billowing like smoke. "I see smoke coming from your chimney. Word is, you've got half the forest stacked inside your living room." "I have enough to keep my family alive, Brody," Thomas said, tightening his grip on the iron poker, keeping his body positioned to block the view of the interior. "What do you want?" "The high school gym," the sheriff said, stepping closer, his boot wedging itself slightly into the doorframe to prevent Thomas from closing it. "We're setting up a triage center. The elderly, the kids, but the backup generator failed an hour ago. We need fuel. We're seizing all available dry wood in the municipal limits under emergency protocols." Thomas felt a cold chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. "You're seizing it? Brody, a fire in that massive gymnasium will burn through a cord of wood a day just to keep it above freezing. You'll burn through my entire supply in less than a week, and then everyone, including me and my daughter, will die." "I'm not asking, Thomas," Sheriff Hayes said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, desperate growl. He placed a heavy gloved hand flat against Thomas's front door, preparing to push his way in. "People are dying right now. Open the door." Thomas stood his ground, the warmth of his home at his back, and the freezing, desperate authority of a dying town staring him in the face. The battle against the ice was over. The battle against his neighbors had just begun. The silence that stretched between Thomas Granger and Sheriff Brody Hayes was heavier than the ice threatening to crush the roof overhead. The 2 deputies behind the sheriff shifted their weight, their boots crunching on the frozen porch, hands hovering nervously near the heavy black flashlights on their belts. Thomas didn't blink. He kept his shoulder firmly pressed against the heavy oak door. "You're seizing my wood, Brody?" Thomas's voice was dangerously calm, lacking the frantic edge of the man standing outside. "Let's talk about the arithmetic of survival. You want to haul 5 cords of dry wood out into a negative 40-degree blizzard, load it into the back of your uninsulated Ford F-250S, and drive it 2 miles to the high school. That's the plan, Granger. Step aside." Deputy Miller, a young man who looked entirely out of his depth, snapped, taking half a step forward. "Shut up, Miller," Thomas fired back, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's. "Brody, listen to me. The high school gymnasium is 20,000 square feet, with 30-foot ceilings and single-pane industrial windows. Heat rises. Do you know what that means? You could burn every log in my living room in 48 hours, and the temperature on the floor of that gym will never rise above 35 degrees. You won't save them. You'll just delay their freezing by 2 days, and you'll kill me and my daughter in the process." Sheriff Hayes squeezed his eyes shut. A heavy sigh rattled in his chest, turning instantly to a cloud of white vapor. He was a good man, a former Marine who was used to order, but the ice storm had stripped away all his protocols. He knew Thomas was right. The backup diesel generator for the school had gelled up because the town hadn't bought winter blend fuel. The gym was a giant walk-in freezer. "Then what the hell do I do, Tom?" the sheriff whispered, the authority draining from his voice, leaving only the terror of a man watching his town die. "I've got Mrs. Gable down the street. Her oxygen concentrator is dead. I've got the Henderson baby, born premature last month. The walls of their trailer are literally covered in frost on the inside." Thomas looked over his shoulder. The living room was a fortress of stacked oak and hickory, smelling of sap and safety. Chloe stood near the roaring cast-iron stove, her eyes wide, shaking her head almost imperceptibly. Bringing people in meant burning more wood, faster. It meant sharing dwindling rations. It meant chaos. But frostbite doesn't just claim toes and fingers. It freezes the human conscience. Thomas couldn't let his freeze. "You don't take my wood," Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave. "You bring the people here." Hayes blinked, stunned. "Here, Tom, your house is insulated," Thomas interrupted. "R49 in the attic, R21 in the walls. I installed a secondary fresh air intake for the stove, so it won't pull the oxygen out of the room. I have space in the basement, the hallways and the kitchen. Bring the most critical cases, the babies, the elderly. No healthy adults. If you bring a crowd, I will lock this door, and you will have to shoot me to get in. Do we have a deal?" The sheriff nodded slowly. "Deal." Over the next 4 hours, Thomas Granger's fortress transformed into a triage center. Sheriff Hayes and his deputies used a modified Polaris Ranger side by side, equipped with snow tracks, to ferry the most vulnerable through the treacherous, glass-slick streets. They brought in Mrs. Gable, her lips entirely blue, weeping silently as the wave of 70-degree air hit her face. They brought in the Henderson baby, bundled in so many layers of heavy Carhartt canvas that the child looked like a tiny breathing parcel. They brought in an 80-year-old retired schoolteacher, suffering from severe hypothermia, her core temperature dangerously low. Chloe immediately went to work. The friction of her father's stubbornness vanished, replaced by an urgent, focused empathy. She boiled water on the flat top of the wood stove, filling Nalgene bottles with hot water, wrapping them in towels, and packing them into the armpits and groins of the hypothermic patients, the only safe way to slowly raise a core temperature without inducing cardiac shock. By nightfall, there were 14 people packed into the house. The indoor woodpile, once a monument to Thomas's paranoia, was now the town's beating heart. But as the sun dipped behind the Rocky Mountains, plunging the valley into a profound, lethal darkness, a new crisis arrived at the front door. It wasn't the police this time. It was Greg Peterson. The corporate litigator looked nothing like the smug man who had mocked Thomas over his artisanal coffee a few weeks prior. Greg was covered in a layer of rime ice. His expensive Arc'teryx Gore-Tex jacket was torn at the elbow, and his face was a mask of sheer panic. Beside him stood his wife, Sarah, clutching their 2 children, aged 6 and 8. The children were crying, a weak, hollow sound that cut through the howling wind. Thomas stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. "Tom, please," Greg begged, his voice cracking. "My wood is a block of concrete. I broke my maul. I tried to burn the dining room table, but the chimney wouldn't draw right, and the smoke filled the house. We can't breathe in there, and we can't stay outside. Please." Thomas looked at the man. Part of him, the bitter, vindictive part that had endured weeks of town gossip and mockery, wanted to shut the door. He wanted to tell Greg to go build a fire with his law degrees. "I told the sheriff no healthy adults, Greg," Thomas said, his voice hard. "Everybody in here breathes oxygen. Every time I open this door, I lose heat. I have 14 critical patients in my living room." "I have money, Tom," Greg pleaded, reaching into his frozen jacket with trembling hands. "I'll pay you. Whatever you want. 10,000. 50,000. Just let my kids in." "Money is just paper right now, Greg," Thomas said coldly. "And it doesn't burn very long." "Dad." Thomas turned. Chloe was standing in the hallway, holding a steaming mug of broth. She looked at her father, then past him to the shivering Peterson children. She didn't say another word, but the look in her eyes was an absolute, immovable ultimatum. If he closed that door, he would lose his daughter forever. Thomas exhaled a long, ragged breath. He stepped back. "Get inside. But you, Greg, you don't sit. You're on fire watch. You keep the stove fed, you empty the ash pan, and if you complain about a single draft, I'll throw you back out into the snow." Greg collapsed through the doorway, falling to his knees on the beige carpet he had once judged Thomas for ruining, sobbing tears of gratitude that thawed the moment they hit his cheeks. By the fourth day of the deep freeze, the atmosphere inside the Granger house had shifted from a sanctuary to a pressure cooker. The storm outside had not relented. In fact, the National Weather Service, broadcasting over Thomas's battery-powered crank radio, confirmed the worst. A secondary Arctic front had stalled directly over Cresthaven. The temperature was holding steady at 42 degrees below zero. The claustrophobia was suffocating. 18 people were now living in a space designed for 3. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the sharp tang of antiseptic. The indoor wood pile, once towering to the ceiling, had been reduced by a third. But it wasn't the dwindling wood that threatened to kill them. It was the wood itself. To conserve his premium, seasoned oak, Thomas had begun mixing in cheaper, fast-burning pine he had harvested late in the season. Pine is resinous. When burned constantly over several days without allowing the chimney to cool and be cleaned, the unburned sap vaporizes, travels up the flue, and condenses on the freezing metal interior as a thick, tar-like substance. Creosote. It was 2 a.m. Greg Peterson was on fire watch, sitting cross-legged in front of the cast-iron stove, mechanically feeding chunks of pine into the belly of the fire. Suddenly, a sound unlike the wind echoed through the house. It started as a low, throaty rumble, like a heavy diesel truck idling in the driveway. Then it escalated rapidly into a ferocious, sucking roar. Thomas, asleep on the kitchen floor, snapped awake. His mechanic's ears instantly diagnosed the catastrophic failure. "Greg, get away from the stove!" Thomas bellowed, scrambling to his feet. The heavy black stovepipe extending from the top of the cast-iron unit to the ceiling was glowing a dull, angry cherry red. The draft intake was whistling, pulling air into the firebox at a terrifying rate. "What is it?" Greg shouted in panic, stumbling backward as the heat radiating from the pipe became unbearable. The other occupants of the house began to stir, cries of alarm rising as the horrific roar vibrated the floorboards. "Chimney fire!" Thomas yelled, grabbing his heavy leather welding gloves. The creosote ignited. If that pipe melts or breaches, the fire spreads into the attic. The whole house goes up in 5 minutes. "Throw water on it," Sheriff Hayes yelled, emerging from the hallway, his hand instinctively going to his weapon as if he could shoot the fire. "No," Thomas screamed. "Water expands to steam instantly. It will literally blow the cast-iron stove into shrapnel and kill half the people in this room. We have to choke it." Thomas sprinted to the kitchen, ripping open cabinets. He grabbed 3 large yellow boxes of Arm & Hammer baking soda, and a heavy iron logging chain he kept under the sink. "Greg, your boots! Now!" Thomas commanded, tossing the lawyer a thick Carhartt beanie. "I need you on the roof." Greg blanched, looking toward the window where the ice storm raged. "The roof?" "Tom, it's -40 out there." "The roof is a sheet of glass. We'll slip and break our necks." "If we don't drop this chain and baking soda down the top of the flue to smash the creosote and starve the oxygen, we burn to death in the snow," Thomas said, his eyes burning with absolute resolve. "You wanted to earn your family's keep? This is it. Move." Seconds later, the two men burst out the back door into the apocalyptic cold. The wind hit them like a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture in their noses and eyes. It was dark, a blinding, swirling whiteout. Thomas had a pair of metal Yak-Trax cleats stretched over his work boots. Greg, fortunately, had worn his expensive, heavily lugged Vibram-soled mountaineering boots when he fled his house. They moved to the side of the house. Thomas grabbed an aluminum extension ladder, its rungs coated in rime ice, and slammed it against the gutters. "I go first. You follow. Keep your center of gravity low." "Do not stand up!" Thomas roared over the wind. Climbing the ladder was agonizing. The metal sapped the heat from their thick gloves instantly. When Thomas crested the roofline, the wind threatened to peel him right off the shingles. The entire roof was encased in 2 inches of clear, solid ice. Crawling on his belly, Thomas hauled himself toward the chimney, which was currently spewing a terrifying 3-foot pillar of orange flame into the blizzard, a dragon breathing fire against the storm. Greg crawled behind him, whimpering, his body trembling so violently he could barely hold on. Suddenly, Greg's left boot slipped. The slick Vibram rubber found no purchase on the smooth ice. He began to slide backward, sliding down the pitch of the roof toward the 2-story drop. "Tom!" Greg screamed. Thomas spun around, planting his spiked boots into a slight depression in the ice, and lunged. He grabbed the collar of Greg's Arc'teryx jacket, just as the man's legs went over the edge of the gutter. The jolt wrenched Thomas's shoulder, tearing a muscle, but he held on. With a guttural roar, Thomas hauled the lawyer back onto the roof. They lay there for a second, gasping, staring into the abyss below. "Don't stop!" Thomas yelled. They reached the chimney. The heat radiating from the brickwork was intense. Thomas handed Greg the boxes of baking soda. "When I drop the chain, pour it all down. Go!" Thomas lifted the heavy iron logging chain and fed it directly into the column of fire, dropping it down the flue. He pulled it up and dropped it again, violently scraping the inside of the pipe, knocking the burning chunks of creosote loose. "Now, Greg!" Greg ripped the tops off the boxes and dumped the white powder directly down the chimney. The baking soda hit the extreme heat and immediately released massive amounts of carbon dioxide. A thick, white cloud of chemical smoke billowed out of the top. The roaring sound sputtered, gasped, and then, mercifully, died. The dragon had been slain. The 2 men collapsed against the warm bricks of the chimney, entirely spent, letting the blizzard wash over them. Greg looked at Thomas, his face raw and frost-nipped, tears freezing on his eyelashes. "Thank you," Greg whispered into the howling wind. "For my kids. For catching me. Thank you." Thomas nodded slowly, the anger that had fueled him for weeks finally burning out, replaced by a profound, weary solidarity. "Let's get inside, counselor. It's cold out here." They survived the night. And the next. On the morning of the 6th day, the wind finally stopped. The sun crested the Rocky Mountains, illuminating a town entombed in glittering, devastating ice. The silence was absolute. Inside the Granger house, the 18 survivors huddled together, watching the thermometer on the wall. They were down to their last half-cord of wood. The arithmetic had finally caught up with them. Then, a new sound broke the silence. It wasn't a roar, it was a deep, rhythmic, mechanical thumping. Thomas walked to the frosted window and wiped away a circle of condensation. Cresting the main road leading into Cresthaven was a massive, yellow Caterpillar D9 bulldozer, proudly bearing the emblem of the Colorado Department of Transportation, CDOT. Behind it trailed a convoy of National Guard snowcats and Red Cross supply trucks. The massive steel blade of the dozer was easily shattering the 3-inch ice sheet, carving a path of salvation right to Thomas Granger's front door. The town of Cresthaven was broken, battered, and forever changed. But inside the house, smelling of oak, pine, and humanity, 18 people were alive to see the sun. They survived because one man knew the storm was coming, and they lived because, in the end, he decided not to weather it alone. Did Thomas make the right call at the door? Frostbite and desperation reveal who we truly are when the grid fails. If this story of survival, preparation, and community chilled you to the bone, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a wake-up call. Subscribe to the channel for more gripping, real-life survival dramas. Stay warm, stay prepared, and we'll see you next time.